Indra Adayaha, demigods headed by the heavenly King Indra.
Demigods headed by the heavenly King Indra.
Bahava, arms, Ahu, are called Ustra, the demigods. Karno, ears, Disha, four directions. Srotram, sense of hearing. Amusha, of the Lord. Shabda, sound. Nasatya Dasthro, the demigods known as the Asvini Kumaras. Paramasya, of the Supreme. Nase, nostrils. Grana, sense of smell. Asya, of him. Gandha, fragrance. Mukam, the mouth. Agni, fire. Idha, blazing. Translation. His arms are the demigods, headed by Indra. The 10 directional sides are his ears, the physical sound of his sense of hearing. His nostrils are the 2 Asvini Kumars, and material fragrance is his sense of smell. His mouth is the blazing fire. Purport, the description of the gigantic form of the personality of Godhead made in the 11th chapter of Bhagavad Gita is further explained here in Srimad Bhagavatam. The description in the Bhagavad Gita 11:30 runs as follows. O Vishnu, I see you devouring all people in your blazing mouths and covering all the universe by your immeasurable rays. Scorching the worlds, you are manifest. In this way, Srimad Bhagavatam is the postgraduate study for the student of Bhagavad Gita. Both of them are the science of Krishna, the absolute truth, and so they are interdependent. The conception of the Virat Purusha, or the gigantic form of the Supreme Lord, is said to include all the dominating demigods as well as the dominated living beings. Even the minutest part of a living being is controlled by the empowered agency of the Lord. Since the demigods are included in the gigantic form of the Lord, worship of the Lord, whether in his gigantic material conception or in his eternal transcendental form as Lord Sri Krishna, also appeases the demigods and all the other parts and parcels, as much as watering the root of a tree distributes energy to all the tree's other parts. Consequently, for a materialist also, worship of the universal gigantic form of the Lord leads one to the right path. One need not risk being misled by approaching many demigods for fulfillment of different desires. The real entity is the Lord himself, and all others are imaginary, for everything is included in him only. Translation is arms of the demigods headed by Indra, the 10 directional signs are his ears, and physical sound is a sense of hearing. His nostrils are the 2 Asvini Kumars, and material fragrance is his sense of smell. His mouth is the blazing fire. So in this description of the universal form, previously the description was in terms of the structure of the universe with its planetary systems. And as was explained, there were 14 levels of planets equated with different organs of his body from the foot to the head. And this also indicated levels of consciousness of different beings. So the lowest consciousness is at the bottom in Patalaloka, and the highest consciousness is in Brahmaloka at the top. And between there we got different levels of consciousness of living entities to indicate that ultimately we should rise from lower to higher consciousness as a human being. So that's more or less a symbolic type of thing. The apart from that, the planet, locating the planetary systems as part of that universal form, here we see a different concept. That is, that there are different organs of the body. We have the primary senses for gathering knowledge, like the eye and the ear, etc. We have the action senses, like the hands and the feet and the voice. So we got those 10 major senses in our body. So the universal form is very similar. It also has senses. So that universal form is not inactive. It can perceive things and hear things and taste things, and it can speak and it can walk and it can hold things, etc. So it's actually a person, that universe. But not only that, these sense organs in the body have devatas in charge of them. So this is maybe a little bit strange for us in the modern world to think of our senses having little devatas sitting on our senses doing things for us, but we'll see this is repeated over and over within the Bhagavatam. And if we look at the creation of the material world and its primary elements, from Mahatattva to Ahankara to the 5 gross material elements, etc., included there are the senses, the 10 senses plus the mind, and the sense devatas. These are actually part of material creation, elements of material creation. Of course, when we talk about devatas, we're talking about their bodies, but we could say that constitutional to creation itself, even before Brahma starts creating bodies for living entities, we have all the ingredients of the body there: the hands, the feet, the head, the eyes, the ears, the mind. They're all there someplace as components that he sticks together in different ways. So there are elements that are eternally manifest within Prakriti itself from the very beginning. And they form into different bodies. So the idea here behind this, the creation and with all the elements, is that the ultimate purpose of creation is not simply manifesting some matter like water and fire and air, but it's to manifest bodies for living entities. And thus we have senses and sense objects and devatas to control those senses inbuilt into matter itself. So in other words, the whole purpose of the creation of the material world is to make bodies for the jivas. That's what it means. And so it's not that just this accidentally over billions of years matter tricked itself in different ways and got together and made some molecules that turned into proteins and amino acids, and they formed into cells, and then we get life. It's not an accident like that. We have senses and mind, and David is in charge of the senses inbuilt into the material world, so they'll naturally begin to form into bodies of living entities. So in other words, the whole material creation is ultimately meant for producing bodies for living entities to do activities on planetary systems, the 14 planetary systems. So we have here the basic ingredients for the human being represented in this universal form. That is, we have a sense organ, like the eye or the ear or the arm. The arms are also considered sense organs, action senses. So here we have the arm, or whatever. And we have a devata, who's in charge of that organ. So in other words, our organ does not operate by itself. You cannot see with the eye unless you got the deity of the eye, which is the sun, Surya. If he doesn't cooperate, you cannot see. If you offend him, then you go blind or whatever like this. So the devata and the sense go together and they cooperate. But the sense also needs an object. So the eye it sees forms. So rupa, or that form, is also part of this creation. So the eye is, we have the universal form with the eye, and along with that we have a devata to make you see, and then to make you see things, you see forms. So all these things are related together. These manifest simultaneously. If we don't have forms, what's the use of having an eye? If you see things but you can't see forms, then there's nothing. So, like that. So, with every sense organ, there's a sense devata and a sense object, which we call the tanmatras. And you'll see that when there's a discussion of creation, that we have all the lists of the tanmatras there, and then the sense organ, and then the material element, which is related to the sense organ also. In this way, the universal form is described here with different sense organs, with different devatas, and different sense objects, all on this universal form. So this is a prototype for our body. Of course, we can say the real prototypes in the spiritual world, where we have spiritual bodies with senses, etc. And then we have the material bodies here. But these material bodies require devatas for making the senses work. Spiritual world, we don't need the devatas. But here we need a devata also involved. So, therefore, we have a description here of all of the different organs, and then there's a devata who is in charge of that organ to make it work properly for the living entities. So in this way, we understand that this, the creation of the universal form is a description to show that ultimately this form should perceive things and do things, and therefore it has senses with sense devatas, etc. So here we have a description of some of these organs and devatas. So the arms have Indra as the ruler, and the ears have the directions, or dik devatas, as their devata in charge of space. And sound is the object that the ears hear. And we have the Asvini Kumars in charge of the nose and the smell, of smelling fragrances. We have the voice and fire. Fire is the deity, devata, Agni. Voice is the action sense. And of course, speaking words is the sense object. And for Indra, you have arms, and the purpose of the arm is to grab things. So these are some of them. And then the next verses will describe the rest of the senses on the body. So the idea here is to show that the creation of the material world is meant for living entities to carry out their activities. And of course, once we ask what activities, then ultimately we come back to the idea that they should, as human beings, progress upwards and get out of the material world. So that's the ultimate purpose of the creation of the material world. So this form here, the immediate, one of the immediate goals of describing this form is to show that behind matter there are certain principles operating which are not chance. So the material elements form into a body, and it's not by chance. All of these things are there at the very beginning, before we get the manifestation of Brahma's creation with material bodies. So it's not chance, it's the plan of the Supreme Lord to produce bodies within this material world that can see and smell and walk and grasp, etc. That's one of the purposes of creation. Another point, of course, is that we should realize that we are not independent in our actions. So we cannot see just by our own energy there's a higher power at work. So it's called the Adidaiva element of us. The Devata is there to invoke the sense to work. So the sun deity is there to inspire our eyes so it can see properly, etc. So for each of our senses, we have some deity in charge. And if the deity is pleased, then we can see properly or walk properly or smell properly or hear properly, etc. So we're not independent in our sense activity as a human being. We have a dependence on a devata also. So there is a higher power at work. We're not completely independent. So that is, of course, a little bit primitive from our Vaishnava point of view. We don't like to worship devatas and whatever, but from a lower point of view, we see in the Vedic literature that people are encouraged to worship devatas so that they can at least accept a higher power. And there's someone above us. We're not completely independent. We do have some dependence on other living entities as well. So the first dependence is on the devatas. So therefore we have to respect those devatas. So that's one level. Of course, then as Srila Prabhupada points out in this purport, the higher level is to understand that these devatas have particular areas of control. So the sun controls the eye, Indra controls the arms, the directions control your sense of hearing in your ear, etc. Each deva has a particular function, local function. And together, if they cooperate, then that body functions nicely. So there has to be cooperation among all the different devatas and organs of the body to do things. So how are we going to get all that cooperation among the different sense organs and devatas? And ultimately the answer is that there's a higher being at work, not many devatas, but one Supreme Lord who is in charge of all the devatas. So if we please the Supreme Lord, then all the devatas get pleased, and therefore our body works properly. So then ultimately we should not just worship devatas and single devatas or many devatas. The easier process is to worship the Supreme Lord behind the devatas. And then our problems are solved. So we go from a polytheistic type of worship to a monotheistic type of worship. Instead of worshiping many gods, we worship one God. And if we worship the one God, the purposes are fulfilled for all the devatas. So in the Bhagavatam, it is also mentioned, the example of the tree is given. So the tree has roots, it has a trunk, it has branches, it has leaves and flowers and fruit. The devatas are like the leaves, and the Supreme Lord is like the root. So if we water the leaves of the tree, we don't get much effect. We have put a drop of water on each leaf, it's not going to do much. If we water the root, fine, then the root accepts the water and it gives nourishment to the whole tree. So it's more intelligent to worship the root. So similarly, it's more intelligent to worship the Supreme Lord than to worship all these devatas to get a nice result. If we worship the Supreme Lord, automatically devatas get their share and they're satisfied, etc. Which means that if we worship the Supreme Lord and please Him, that the devatas are satisfied and we don't have to worship them separately. So that is another point that is made here. Another example is also given. It is like the stomach. So we eat food, and the food goes to the stomach, and it gets digested, and then it gives nourishment to the different senses. And we have to follow that process. If we become a little more intelligent and say, well, why don't I just feed the eye? or the ear. So we can try to put some food on the ear or the eye or whatever, but that's not going to do anything. It's not going to be very satisfying. So the proper process is to put the food in the stomach, and the stomach distributes nicely to all the different organs of the body. So, in other words, we should not go directly to the devatas. We should go to the controller of the devatas, Supreme Lord. If the Supreme Lord is satisfied, then everyone else is satisfied. So this is a principle that is mentioned in different places in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So therefore, rather than worshipping many devatas, we worship one Supreme Lord. Of course, in this example, it's material. We satisfy the Lord so we get nourishment in our body, or the tree gets nourished, etc. So we can worship the Lord so we have good health and we live a long life. That's material. But that's the lowest level. The other is, of course, that going beyond the material body, we have the jiva, or the atma, the soul. So we also have to think of how to satisfy the soul, and not just the body. So this is where we get into a spiritual discussion. So then there is also a way in which we can satisfy the Atma. And it's by the same process, worship of the Supreme Lord. So we can fulfill both functions. That is, we can keep our material situation comfortable by worshiping Supreme Lord, who then pacifies all the devatas. And we also give satisfaction to the jiva by that worship of the Lord. So the jiva himself gets satisfied by this and can experience bliss. So the worship of the Supreme Lord has a double function. It takes care of things in the material world, and it also takes care of our spiritual life. So twofold function there. So behind this, of course, is this whole discussion about the yogi, and the immature yogi concentrates on this Virat Rupa form, which is basically material elements and material bodies, etc., and results for the material body. And the more advanced yogi will concentrate on the spiritual form of the Lord, that is Paramatma. So the yogi who concentrates on Paramatma is more advanced because he accepts a spiritual form, not a material form. But as Prabhupada mentions in the purport, at least for the materialists, let them worship this type of, or conceive of this form and worship and respect this universal form. And then gradually they can elevate themselves to a more refined version of form, that is, form of Paramatma. Even that form is not ultimate. It's certainly spiritual, in that way it's perfect. The form of Vishnu is Paramatma. But this is not the form that the devotees worship. It's the form that the yogis worship. Of course, it is exactly the same as the form in the spiritual world. If we look at it from a material point of view, it has 4 arms, it is bluish in color. He's called Vishnu, so it looks exactly the same as Bhagavan in Vaikuntha. But that Paramatma form actually is distinguished from Bhagavan by limitation of qualities and powers. And consequently relationship. So the yogis look at Paramatma as the witness of everything, the all-knowing Lord who creates and destroys the material world. And so he's the source of everything, and he's spiritual, and from him come all the jivas and material world, etc. So that is the conception of the yogis. So the good part is that there's the personal form of the Lord, the Vishnu form, which is spiritual, not material. The negative aspect, it's a limitation of the Lord, because the yogi is thinking of the Lord as a conscious entity who knows everything in the material world. He pervades everything, witnesses everything, creates and destroys everything. Fine, that's part of the Lord, but it's not the complete Lord. So therefore, we put that on a lower level. So what is the more complete form? The complete form of the Lord is to realize more qualities than simply qualities of knowledge and power. So when we recognize the love in the Supreme Lord, the mercy in the Supreme Lord, the various subtle qualities that attract the devotees, when we realize those qualities, then this form turns into Bhagavan. And what's superior about this is the jiva can establish a very wonderful, loving relationship with him and experience the highest bliss. Whereas with the yogi, it's more or less peaceful, shanta relationship. So with the Bhagavan, one can establish higher relationships like dasya, sakya, vatsalya, madhurya. So that's the preferable form that the devotees worship and meditate on. So here we have this whole gradation of if you can't do this, you do this. If you can't do this, do this. If you can't do this, do this. So we're starting at the bottom here. If you can't do anything and you have a material conception of everything, you think of the whole world as a personal form of the Lord with working parts and planets and everything in it. And at least we accept that the Lord has a form. From that we can graduate to the Paramatma form, who is a personal form but spiritual. And from that we can get a more personal form, Bhagavan, who exhibits many qualities beyond relating to the material world. So that's basically these are the different forms that are described here. Okay, any question now?
Thank you so much. You mentioned about how the senses, each of the senses and parts of the body is a demigod, and if the relationship is not good, then the sense may not work properly.
Yeah, okay.
But then, what is the relationship of this with karma? Because it looks like if somebody doesn't, eyes is not functioning properly, we say it's more to do with the karma rather than with the demigod. We don't associate anything with the demigod.
Yeah. Well, the eye has a devata, it also has a planet, and then we have astrology. So planets in astrology, you got a bad planet there, and then the deity in charge of the planet's not pleased, so therefore you get bad effect on that part of your body. So sun is in charge of the eye, you got a weak sun, then you get weak eyes, which means previous lifetime you must have offended the sun deity or something, you did something wrong with the sun, so you got weak eyes, and therefore the sun is debilitated or something in your chart or whatever, it's in the wrong place, 8th house or something like this. So the planet and the devata and the senses and the different organs of the body are kind of all related to each other. And in astrology is basically mapping out your karmas. So it picks out the weak points, the bad planets, the weak planets, etc. So that's your bad karma. And then kind of it advises you how to pacify the planet and pacify the devata and then improve your karma. So it's basically the same thing, with the realization that all this karma means it's from previous activities in which we've done some sinful activity, and in that sinful activity we have to offend certain devatas. So according to who we offend, then we get different karmas on different parts of our body from that.
Right. The Virat Rupa, you mentioned how Virat Rupa is the original ingredient, comes from there, and the demigods, they are in charge. So in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, we see that we consider Virat Rupa as more a material form of the Lord.
Yeah.
Whereas the other three Vaishnavas are the Madhvas, they give a lot of importance to Virat Rupa because they do the Purusha Shukta prayers as their topmost.
Oh, well, there's also another form, you see, that is also a Garbhodakshaya form, that Purusha Shukta. So that's actually a spiritual form of the Lord, who is in charge of the material world also in one sense, because it's from Garbhodakshaya Vishnu who gets Brahma, and from Brahma comes the material world, so he's like, he contains everything. Or we say it's even Mahavishnu, who's got all the universes within him. So it's also the spiritual form, that Purusha Shukta. Yeah.
seems that depending on the type of body you have, and there's various demigods reside in. In other words, the plant doesn't have eyes, so people not need certain demigods to go inside. And it's based on that assumption, if it's correct, that more or less demigods reside in different types of bodies. And we hear of the cow, that all the demigods reside in the cow. Is there a reason for that, or is it does the cow have more subtle abilities that we're not aware of?
We should ask you that, maybe. You're in charge of the cows. You see them have extraordinary abilities. So anyway, normally animals, they have all their senses intact, but we go lower animals, they have less senses. We get to plants, less developed senses or whatever. But it's even surprising that plants, they don't have nervous systems, they don't have ears, they don't have noses or whatever, they don't have brains or anything, but they can still sense things. So they can sense people and what people are doing, and they react to that also. So they react to your feelings. The plants do also. And there's some scientific experiments to show how plants react. And someone who they hate because they know they got real bad vibrations comes close, they don't like that at all, So plants somehow are able to pick up something. It's not like our senses and our nervous system, etc., but we cannot say that they're not aware of things. It's all definitely more primitive, less developed, but nevertheless they do have their reactions to things in the world around. So we can say in the lower forms, that's why the class is lower forms, the senses are less developed, and we get to the animals more developed. We get to the human being, not only the senses are developed, but then the mind gets much more developed to have memory powers and intelligence, etc. And that distinguishes the human being from the animal. So we say the human being is the one who best represents this universal form, because you get all his senses intact, with the mind and intelligence and false ego, they're all operating in a higher capacity as a human being. So therefore it's preferable that you get born as a human being than an animal or a plant, because then your senses can operate fully, and then you can utilize all of this to advance spiritually, whereas the animals and plants cannot do that. So there's an advantage to the human form of life. As for the cow is actually very special, because we know that's praised in the Vedic literature, etc. Also very dear to Krishna. So though it is, we do find statements in the scripture itself, and they say, it's dull-headed like a cow or something like that. So they're not the most intelligent beings. Also, they're in one sense their senses and their intelligence is limited in some ways. Nevertheless, we find great praises of the cow in many places, and so therefore it's very, among all the living entities on the animals, it's very, very special. So therefore it's praised as having, representing all the Devatas, etc.
Hi, Krishna Maharaj. During the lecture, you mentioned that for the senses to work properly, there needs to be a coordination between the demigods. So, assuming that there are two demigods who have some friction between them, do they cause impact on all the living beings in the universe at the same time?
No, it's individual. Yeah. Of course, we can have universal karma, I suppose, or world karma or something like that. Where they were talking about that, I think, a few days ago, when the Saturn and Jupiter conjunct or something, but nothing really happened. But maybe the whole year is in charge of that, so that's why the whole year is bad. But so we get universal effects also. So, but in terms of in astrology, they do have enemy planets, and they get close to each other and they fight with each other. Then that's considered very bad also, because both planets get weakened by that. So therefore, whatever that planet is in charge of, or that Devata is in charge of, also gets weakened in your body because of that. Yeah. Right? Okay. Hare Krishna.